So we're moving on to our next session, which I'm really excited about because, as I mentioned at the beginning, much like what Bettina had said, I couldn't find anyone that was an expert in this area when I was running a digital festival. And after 5 years, the International Symposium on Electronic Art basically used my festival as a legacy project. And around that time, Andreia introduced me to Simondon, and I said to her, really, never heard of it, ever. And she said to me, but we need, in this field of media art, we need more people in South Africa familiar with his work. And so we reached out, as I said earlier, to a number of universities. And so imagine my delight when Renzo says, no, we have speakers for our session. I was like, yay, they're going to give us the answers that we're looking for. So when Bettina spoke, I'm like, I'm so glad it's not just me. So I think it's really important. I'm looking forward to the session. What I will ask, because it's a much more intimate setting, I will ask you just to introduce yourself to us. I mean, often, we see people cringing when the facilitator reads out their long bio, but I think that it's really important. I also want to say to colleagues who have joined us online, we're really sorry that the third speaker, Chantal, can't be with us today. There's been a bit of a family emergency, and I was really looking forward to hearing about this connection in her thinking in relation to Ubuntu. And so I'm going to have to follow up and just follow her work. But I know that she works with you. So this is going to be a really interesting session. And I want to say to my South African colleagues in particular, we must ask the question as we try to really make sense of and see the relevance, not just to South Africa, but to the human condition at a particular moment in time, in a particular context. I think we really need to ask more questions right now than search for all the answers necessarily. But yeah, just over to you. If you can just introduce yourself, and then we'll do your presentation, and then we'll go straight into you and your presentation, and then we'll invite a series of questions. All right. So thank you very much, and you'll hear from me again later.
Okay. So I'm going to give a very quick bio. My name is Aragorn Eloff. I'm a PhD student at Northwest University in the Department of Philosophy. And my PhD work focuses on what I call psychedelic individuation, which is examining contemporary psychedelic neuroscience from the perspective of Deleuze, Guattari, and Simondon. And I'm not sure I'm an expert, but I am grappling with Simondon. I'm also a bit jet lagged. I arrived back from Taiwan yesterday, where I was at a Deleuze conference. And in fact, I was on the Simondon panel, and it was very striking to me that there was a big panel full of Simondon people at the Deleuze conference, which just goes to show that obviously Simondon is having a moment right now, and there's a renewed interest in his work. And I'm particularly interested in how this renewed interest in his work can intersect with contemporary science. So there's a provocative statement that Simondon gives somewhere towards the end of the Individuation book, right? Individuation in light of notions of form and information. And he says this. He says the apeiron, which is the unbounded, is perhaps undetermined only with respect to the individuated being. There are perhaps various modalities of the undetermined which would explain why specific cases and specific tensions are required for the birth of the collective or the trans-individual, and in order to have a certain number of chances of stability in all cases. One could perhaps define in this way classes of a prioris, impossible significations, categories of potentials, stable pre-relational bases. The concepts to carry out such a study are lacking. So I'm really interested. This is towards the end of the Individuation book. It's where he's talking about the trans-individual, right? And how psychic individuation occurs at this juncture between living and trans-individual, right? There's always this desperation that occurs that gives rise to the psychic. And what he's trying to talk about here, right at the end of this book, just before he starts speaking about ethics, interestingly, he doesn't have a politics, but he's got an ethics, is that when he's thinking individuation, right, which the whole book is about, when he's trying to think ontogenesis and what gives rise to being, he describes a pre-individual field. He talks about how that field can be exhausted or how it can non-exhaustively actualize through this whole process of individuation. But towards the end of the book, he wants to start thinking about what the pre-individual actually is and how we can start articulating different kinds of metastabilities, right? Another way he talks about the pre-individual is in terms of metastability. And he says that the resources for such a study are lacking, right? He's writing this book in 1958 as part of his PhD. And he's grappling with how do we begin to articulate what the pre-individual is, what the metastable is, right? In terms of not just following thought as a process of individuation, but thinking in terms of the distributions of what gives rise to thought. And Deleuze takes this a little bit further in the direction of the virtual and thinking about the differential field that through dramatization gives rise to the actual. But I'm more interested in the fact that the resources that Simondon thought were lacking when he wrote this book in 1958 are emerging in kind of strange places within contemporary science. And one of the places that they're emerging is in contemporary psychedelic neuroscience, right? So I'm going to give a very, very quick 5-minute overview of what's happening in this field. I'm not going to include a broader discussion of cognitive science, but there is also a Simondonian turn happening in contemporary cognitive science, particularly within enactivism. So if you guys know the work of Evan Thompson, Ezekiel De Paulo, Hannah de Jager, people who've been influenced by Francisco Varela, they've talked about how being is embodied, enactive, embedded, extended. We participate in modes of ongoing becoming with our environments. We deeply imbricated with those environments. And they've started to think about the spaces of possibility that give rise to the ways in which we become and are embodied within those environments. And one of the resources they've explicitly started to draw on in more recent work is the work of Simondon. So in cognitive science, we're seeing this sort of slow move towards this guy was onto something 60-something years ago, right? In terms of how we speak about not just the individual, but what gives rise to the individual. So within psychedelic neuroscience specifically, we're seeing a bunch of shifts away from what's called the neural reductionist model, right? Where for many decades, people thought of cognitive science in terms of we have a bunch of neurons in our head, and they have axons and dendrites, and they communicate through electrical signals. And if we can just map out those neurons sufficiently, then we understand how the brain works and what gives rise to consciousness. And what we're now seeing, in the last decade at least, is that this is emphatically not the case. And that what's more interesting and more important, when we particularly thinking about what gives rise to conscious experience, is the emergent capacities of the brain, right? So not just the interactions between individual neurons, but all the higher order sort of emergent phenomena that operate recursively to constrain those actions on that base molecular level, right? So we have all these sort of base level interactions, they give rise to all these emergent properties and what's called the emergent constraint regimes. And then those construct a domain of possibility, a domain of potential that reinforces that recursive relationship, right? So we've moved from reduction to emergence. We've also moved towards the idea of thinking of the brain in terms of dynamic systems theory. So if any of you are familiar with Manuel de Landa's work on Deleuze, even though he doesn't mention Simondon, his work is deeply Simondonian. He speaks about the Deleuzian virtual in a way that we can also think of the pre-individual in Simondon as being a kind of phase space, a kind of distribution of different tendencies of a system over time, different vectors, different directions of flow, distributing the possibilities of a system over time. And we can think of those in terms of not sort of linear Sorry, I'm losing myself a little bit. Give me 1 second. Trying to get through a lot in a very short period of time without going on a tangent. Okay, then I'll take it a bit slower. So one of the ways of thinking about the Deleuzian virtual or the Simondonian pre-individual is in terms of phase spaces, right? In terms of these distributions of tendencies of systems over time and mapping out a set of vectors that show what any particular system does over time. By mapping out a whole set of those trajectories, we can start to define that phase space, that space of potential of the system, where any particular individuation, any particular ontogenesis within that system traverses a particular set of vectors towards and away from various attractors, right? So the one sort of popular way of visualizing this is the famous sort of double arc butterfly diagram. If any of you have seen that in chaos mathematics and chaos theory, you have this very interesting image of something that looks like it repeats with difference every time and maps out what looks like a pair of butterfly wings. That's an attractor, right? That's showing how a system moves over time, the various tendencies of a system over time, but it never quite repeats itself. There's always a little bit of differentiation. So we started thinking about the brain in this way, because when we map brain activity using fMRIs and EEGs and all these kinds of technologies, that's what the brain does, right? It has this patterned and coordinated emergent behavior, but it's behavior that's never exactly rigorously the same. It's never identical from moment to moment, right? So Deleuze would call this inexact yet rigorous. The brain operates in an inexact yet rigorous way. It also operates in a way that's far from equilibrium. When we model simple linear systems in the world, they operate at what's called equilibrium state. So if we model what water does at most of the temperatures of water, if we get some water and make it like 20 degrees Celsius or something, and we model the dynamic of the individual water molecules, it exhibits broadly equilibrium behavior, very linear behavior. It's got a kind of predictable dynamic when we slowly turn up that temperature, until we start reaching these threshold points, right? If we get water almost to the point of boiling or freezing, when it exhibits something called a phase transition, then we begin to see this non-equilibrium behavior, this non-linear behavior start to occur. This is behavior that neuroscientists will often talk about as being incredibly information-rich, right? Because it puts a system near a point of criticality where that system can bifurcate into a different set of dynamic behaviors, right? So ice is different from water, water is different from gas. And near those threshold points, so when you start boiling water, you see all these sort of convection cycles and these complex turbulent flows start to emerge. And that shows a system that's at this liminal space where it can split off and bifurcate and break into different individuations, different non-exhaustive actualizations of being, right? So it's a way of bringing a system closer to metastability by bringing it towards one of these near criticality points. And what we see in psychedelic neuroscience is that the brain, even in its default resting state, is near a point of criticality all the time. And in fact, that accounts for the information richness of our brains, the way we're able to process so much information. But when we ingest psychedelics, our brains move closer towards these points of criticality and exhibit more complex behavior, right? So we're bringing our brains closer towards metastability or the pre-individual when we use psychedelics, or whether we use other techniques to generate a renewed relationship to that pre-individual field, right? So another way of thinking about this, there's some interesting Japanese chaos theory researchers who have spoken about the brain being a homeochaotic system, right? In cybernetics, we have this idea of homeostasis, that systems are these recursive sort of self-adaptive agents that try to retain an equilibrium and minimize their free energy and everything else, to keep functioning as systems, right? This is also core to autopoiesis. But these Japanese researchers have modeled brain behavior as being closer to this idea of homeochaos, and that it's maintaining systems near these liminal points of metastability, right? Near these sort of criticality states that accounts for the brain being able to keep doing what brains are supposed to do, right? So we need to keep our brains close to chaos, or in Simondon's terms, close to the metastable, in order to not lapse into epileptic seizures, which are highly equilibrium states, which are far from metastability, or into the chaos of psychosis, maybe, which is the other side of criticality. Okay, and just one more quick thing on this is that we're starting within psychedelic neuroscience and neuroscience more broadly, people are starting to talk about what they call spatiotemporal neuroscience. So what we're starting to see is, on the one level, that the spatial architecture of the brain and the temporal oscillations of the brain are both equally necessary and give rise to cognitive behavior and deeply inform each other, but also that temporality and spatiality arise from these ongoing nested temporal spatial loops that occur through these higher level emergent orders in the brain. So it's not just that spatial and temporal aspects of the brain are important, it's that the spatiotemporal itself emerges from cognitive architecture and from the neuronal oscillations of that cognitive architecture, right? Francesco Varela used to talk about this a lot in terms of resonance cell assemblies, right? All these different parts of the brain start oscillating in phase with each other, and these phase synchronizations are what give rise to this higher order emergent behavior. So there's something deeply temporal about our capacity for ongoing cognitive acts. And the one really, really interesting contemporary example of this within psychedelic neuroscience is what's called connectome harmonics, right? So this, for any of you who are familiar with what a Kalagny plate is, you take a plate and you put sand on it and you vibrate it at different frequencies. At most frequencies, nothing happens. It's just sand moving around on a plate. At certain frequencies, different resonant potentials of the material start to become expressed, and the sand will arrange itself into all those various patterns, which, to go back to what I was saying earlier, are almost like the attractor spaces of that particular material, right? That piece of metal and the sand on it, for instance. So in very much the same way as the structural dynamics of the material and the frequencies of oscillation constrain the sorts of patterned.
Sorry, I was just writing. We have an issue that your PowerPoint is just still in the first page. It's not moving by the.
Okay.
Let me check what can be. Sorry.
Sometimes it's better don't share the screen.
No, I'm sharing the screen there.
Yeah,
it looks like he's in the correct one.
Yeah.
No, you are in the correct one. Actually, Pablo writing me that he's watching just the first slide. Oh, you're in the correct one.
Okay. Okay, so
Sorry, I said that was in the transmission, not in the transmission. What I'm saying now in my screen, but
Okay,
no,
okay. Thank you, Pablo.
doesn't matter. Sorry.
okay, cool. So very briefly, connectome harmonics takes this idea of Kalagny plates, and it says, okay, what if we take the structural connectome of the human brain, which is all the connective tissue and the spatial architecture of our actual gray matter, and we oscillate at different frequencies, and we see what sort of spatial distributions take place in the brain when we look at different neural oscillations. So if you look at neural oscillations in the brain, they happen at sort of 5 orders of temporal scale. We have very fast oscillations that happen in milliseconds. We have much longer cycles that happen over seconds and even hours. So if we take all these different frequencies that we know brain oscillations happen at, and we map them onto the structural connectome of the human brain, the gray matter, in much the same way as we vibrate that sand on the plate, we get all these same emergent patterns occurring on the brain itself, right? So it's, yeah, it's fMRIs. So they take magnetic resonance imaging data, and then they perform a set of mathematical operations on it. And they're able to decompose that fMRI data into all the different frequency bands. And then they map those frequency bands onto the structural connectome. And so what you're getting is you're getting a pattern that shows how prevalent each of those different frequencies of brain activity is in any particular one of those brain scans. So now they're doing brain scans of people in a regular state of consciousness, and then maybe after ingesting psilocybin or LSD or another psychedelic, or meditating or sleeping or whatever else. And they're seeing that qualitatively distinct connectome harmonic architectures emerge in each of these different neural states, right? And if you think about this in an intuitive way, I like the term connectome harmonics, because they're thinking about it in terms of a musical harmonic series almost, right? So that in each state of consciousness, psychedelic, normal, meditation, and so on, you have a particular sort of musical structure almost emerging in the brain, a particular set of connectome harmonics. And what they're finding is that on LSD, for instance, a more complex harmonic structure emerges, and something that looks a lot more like jazz or free improvisation, whereas our default states of consciousness might look a lot more like very composed sort of Baroque classical music or something like this. Epilepsy would maybe look a lot like techno. So what this is showing, this is the sort of most cutting edge research at the moment, showing the deeply spatiotemporal architecture of the brain and the deeply spatiotemporal nature of all the dynamisms that give rise to ongoing processes of thought. And it's trying to model this in a way that we might be able to one day have some traction on, right? Because of these different sort of frequency bands of oscillatory activity are giving rise to different states of consciousness based on structural connectome, right? So if they're different non-exhaustive individuations of a pre-individual fund, right? Because we can think of the brain itself as capable of individuating with any sort of nested set of oscillatory dynamics, right? The brain contains all possible harmonics, right? These are just sort of individual ontogenetic dynamisms then, right? A particular set of connectome harmonics in a particular state of consciousness, one actualization, one individuation. Okay. And Simondon says this in a, sorry, I have to come here to read this. Simondon actually talks about the spatiotemporal nature of contemporary neuroscience in a very interesting way without obviously knowing. He talks about this being a profoundly immanent way of thinking about the brain. Becoming is not a framework within which the being exists. It is the being's dimension, the mode of resolution of an incompatibility that is rich in potentials. But also, time emerges from the pre-individual just like the other dimensions according to which an individuation effectuates itself. The pre-individual is the source of chronological and topological dimensionality. So obviously Simondon's not a contemporary neuroscientist. He wrote this in 1958, and he's trying to think of individuation without imposing any sort of transcendence on it, right? And the whole of the individuation book is full of critiques of transcendent philosophy. He's trying to think completely imminently about emergent dynamisms, but it's profoundly opposite in thinking about what we're learning from spatiotemporal neuroscience through a Simondonian lens, right? That space and time themselves arise from this interplay of oscillatory dynamics and neuronal architectures, right? Because remember, the brain is plastic. We have a certain degree of neuroplasticity or metastability, and in these psychedelically altered states, we have increased potential for plasticity, right? So again, space and time imminently emerge from these individuations of a pre-individual fund, right? Okay, so we can think of this, Simondon calls this a project of alagmatics, right? By alagmatics, he's talking about what sustains the metastable. And he also talks rather beautifully about what he calls the two deaths. And this happens towards the end of the individuation book, where he's speaking about the trans individual. And in contemporary psychedelic therapy, the idea of death, the small death, the death of the ego, is seen as the fundamental therapeutic component. So transformative experiences usually involve some form of so-called drug-induced ego death, right? Sort of transformation and overcoming. And even if we look back to indigenous cultures of psychedelics use, the idea of death and transfiguration is a core sort of component of those experiences. And this is a perennial feature of psychedelics use in many, many different cultural contexts, right? The idea of death and transfiguration. And the first way Simondon will speak about this, I'm not going to read out the whole quotes, you can read them, but he'll speak about this in terms of the pre-individual becoming exhausted, right? He says, particularly as a system ages, as a system becomes too individualized and stability set in, that the capacity to draw on those pre-individual reserves diminishes, right? Being becomes too sedentary, to use a Deleuzian term, right? Too stratified. If you think about the assemblage in Deleuze, having one side pointed towards the strata, the very strictly delineated and laid out and territorialized, and the other side pointing towards the abstract machine, right? Becoming lines of flight, creative dynamisms. What Simondon is saying is, as life progresses, we can suffer this first death, whereby there's a death of our capacity to operate ongoing ontogenesis, right? Ontology collapses into its final form, and this results in either the small death, right? The small death of nothing new happening in life, or obviously the great death of final mortality. But he'll also talk about what he calls the second death. He doesn't actually use these terms of the two deaths. This is me just putting words in his mouth. But towards the end of the book again, he'll talk about, in a very strange way, he'll talk about transformative experiences. He actually invokes Nietzsche here, and he talks about transformative experiences that give us renewed access to the pre-individual funds, right? Renewed capacities for ontogenesis as involving a kind of anxiety. So what he says is that the anxious being feels that it might be able to be reconcentrated within itself in an ontological beyond that supposes a change in all dimensions. But in order for this new birth to be possible, so think about this, the death rebirth dynamism, he's speaking about this in a sense that's very close to how contemporary psychedelic therapy speaks about this. In order for this new birth to be possible, the dissolution of the previous structures and the reduction of the previous functions and potential must be complete, which is an acceptance of the annihilation of the individuated being, right? So if we think about drug-induced ego death, or in contemporary neuroscience, there's a framework called REBUS, Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics and the Anarchic Brain Hypothesis. They're saying something almost identical to this, which is we can individuate badly, we can exhaust the pre-individual funds, we can be entrenched in a bad individuation, right? A mode of being that no longer serves us, that represents the bad kind of death, that habituates us too much in the present, and we exhaust the possibilities for the future. We exhaust our metastable potentials. And the way to get back to metastability, whether it's psychedelically or otherwise, is through this transformative experience of the second death, right? The dissolution of the individuated being.
Maybe you can tell people who is involved with the term Icarus.
Right, yes. So, indeed. So, that first quote over here, I call for the good spirits to come. I want them to arrive like a whirlpool. I want the good spirits to arrive here as a whirlpool and enter with power inside your body. That's an Icaro. That's one of the traditional songs that is. Oh, I think there's a slide missing. Wait. Oh, I lost the slide, but let me draw this together with a definition of what Icaros are, right? So in ayahuasca cultures in the Amazon basin, the curandero, or shaman as it's called in some cultures, they will, as part of the facilitation of these transformative death rebirth experiences, often sing. And they sing what sound like very simple songs, and lyrically they're very, very simple. Like, it often sounds almost like nursery rhymes or like almost platitudinous. Very, very simple statements. You know, I hope everyone has a good journey. I hope everyone has a great journey. The lyrics are typically on that level. I welcome the sun, I welcome the moon. It's just very basic statements of the reality in which people find themselves in those experiences. But the important thing about the Icaros, and many people will talk about this as being a very powerful part of the experiences, the Icaros are seen as a way to navigate the experiential dynamics, right? So to allow for different kinds of individuations to happen and to guide the experience in different ways. These very powerful yet simple songs will be used expertly by curanderos to, and specifically as a technology. A lot of the people who use these will talk about them being a specific form of technology. These songs are a technology. We'll use them to, again, allow that metastable field to collapse into a specific individuative dynamism based on simple oscillatory dynamics, right? So it's a song, it's a series of oscillations and harmonics, and people undergoing ayahuasca experiences will often talk about the deeply vibrational aspects of these songs, and a lot of the sort of patterned imagery that people experience and then document or try document afterwards demonstrates these sort of what looks very similar to those Caladni plates or those connectome harmonic patterns. Very interesting vibrational patterned material. It's often experienced in this way, as a vibratory technology of becoming is maybe one way to put it. So for me, the idea of the Icaro is it's a sort of intuitive sense or a technological sense of the ways in which we're starting to learn brains work and how brains operate in these near criticality metastable states, and how if those metastable brains individuate badly and we suffer the first death, we can regain access to these pre-individual fields through the second death that can be facilitated through these vibrational technologies of becoming. Does that make sense? So that's it. And I think just to wrap up, I think it is important, just to reiterate this, I think I said it at the beginning, but Simondon doesn't have an explicit politics. And of course, we can turn to Deleuze if we want to see a politics that's based on the pre-individual. But Simondon does very importantly have an ethics. And it's an ethics of the future and of cultivating a better metastable field. And here it's vital to note that psychic individuation, right, It's a slowing down of living individuation, and it's the intersection of living individuation and the trans individual. There's something necessarily always collective about our psychic individuations, and an ethics of constructing better conditions of trans individuality is already a kind of politics for me. So I think there is a politics subtly embedded in Simondon's work that maybe has all sorts of consequences for how we think about the political act. Okay.
Can I just start, or?
Yes,
Okay.
but remember to introduce yourself.
Yes,
so everyone
yes.
online is aware.
Let's do that. Okay, cool. All right. Hello, my name is Rudi van Rensburg. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of the Free State. I'm busy finishing off my PhD, and my research into Simondon. Well, basically, I'm also not an expert on Simondon. My kind of connection to him is mostly tied to work I've done on Stigler, Bernard Stigler, who all of you know is a big Simondonian. And then as well, Yakui is also one of the influences on me, who introduced me to Simondon. And then obviously, as his works became more translated into English, it became easier to access his works as well. Okay, so the paper will consider Simondon's theory of individuation in the light of the biometric state, which is, for those of you who are from Wits, you'll know that Keith Breckenridge, or Professor Keith Breckenridge, is a historian here at Wits, and he wrote this book, The Biometric State, in 2014, in which he basically traces the development of identification systems, and especially in South Africa, it is the centralized population registry, which is quite a significant, let's say, technological development, which led to the biometric state, which you can also oppose to the modern state, which is kind of personified and is mostly based on written systems and these kinds of things, where the biometric state kind of tries to surpass the written form of registration and these things. I'll get into that later. But yeah, so it'll be argued that the biometric state as a statistical regime of identification that functions on race classification, fingerprinting, and so on, is paradigmatic of the digital society in which we've become enveloped. The digital can be described by what Simondon calls the post-industrial technical object, which, and I quote, is a unity of two layers of reality, a layer that is stable and permanent, or is as stable and permanent as possible, which adheres to the user and is made to last, and a layer that can be perpetually replaced, changed, renewed, because it is made up of elements that are similar, impersonal, mass-produced by industry, and distributed by all the networks of exchange. All right, so it will be argued that the biometric paradigm provides the stable layer upon which digital technologies are being applied as they continue to evolve into ever more fancy devices provided by industry in our daily lives, as we know. The implications of the function of this paradigm will be drawn from the historical consequences that we can see in South African society, from the segregation of laborers on the mines in the colonial era to the apartheid state and the post-apartheid kind of features that developed in relation to biometrics. So here, Simondon's notion of transduction will be brought in relation to the biometric subject and its effective consequences for psychic and collective individuation. It will be argued that what Simondon calls a technical mentality needs to be adopted to resist the repetitions of history. So the background to this question comes from just a curiosity that I had about what is the relation between cybernetics and the apartheid ideology. Because on a basic level, just a correlation, you can say that the apartheid system is a system of control, and it seems quite obvious that it must have been some kind of cybernetic idea behind it. But okay, so a quick search on the internet doesn't yield any results showing a direct connection between apartheid and cybernetics, apart from Gotthard Günther, who was one of the key figures in cybernetics. He was in the University of Stellenbosch, or he lived there for 2 years in 1940. So this is well before cybernetics really developed after the Second World War. Okay, so so in any case, yeah, so the question was, is there a connection between cybernetics and apartheid? Didn't really find anything, but I thought, okay, let me go look into computers, the history of computers in South Africa, and immediately find that the first computers were used for the population database, to kind of register everything on the database or to transfer everything onto the database. And it was also, some of the first computers were also used in the nuclear program during apartheid. So in any case, these are just some outlines. I draw on Jacques Rui's idea of digital objects, which he emphasizes that in the 1970s, the development of database systems and so on really is where the digital started taking off. And I was also considering Matteo Pasquinelli's book, the recent book, The Eye of the Master, where he was talking about the labor history of AI. I was considering, in what sense, as South Africa also, is South Africa involved in this whole history, which is obviously not part of his discussion, but what I found in the end was much more interesting, which is when I came across Keith Breckenridge's book. I realized that these things have been taking place in South Africa for much longer, and it's actually a much older debate, or rather kind of development in terms of biometrics, which we could say is kind of classifying people, giving them numbers, classifying them according to their fingerprints, all these kinds of things which can be put into, basically can be eventually processed by computers. Okay, so I don't know if I mentioned in the beginning, but my research is about digitalization. So the connection to Simondon comes from, firstly, firstly I consider the digital as a paradigm. So I follow Giorgio Agamben's discussion of the paradigm in the Signature of All Things. One of the most important aspects of the paradigm, which Agamben highlights, is that its logic is that of the analogy. And this also connects us to Simondon's definition of the technical mentality, which he says offers a mode of knowledge sui generis, means it creates its own form of knowledge. The analogy creates its own space of intelligibility. Okay, let me just restart that quote. Okay, so the technical mentality offers a mode of knowledge sui generis that essentially uses the analogical transfer and the paradigm, and founds itself on the discovery of common modes of functioning or of regimes of operation in otherwise different orders of reality that are chosen just as well from the living or the inert as from the human or the non-human. So as a form of knowledge, the paradigm functions on the analogy, which is neither a deductive nor inductive form of reasoning. Although Aristotle defines the paradigm or argument by example as a rhetorical induction, which aims to convince an audience, the paradigm takes on another meaning in Plato, and I think Simondon might be closer to Plato's definition of the paradigm. We can discuss that later, but in Plato it's much more mathematical, but in Aristotle you see the paradigm actually also speaks to basically the assumptions of especially an audience, so you have to kind of convince someone with a paradigm, where with Plato the paradigm is closer to a model. You build a model. He says in the Timaeus that there's only one paradigm of the cosmos. There's only one copy of the cosmos, which is the demiurge's creation. So it's created out of his idea. And then the earth, or let's say the cosmos, is a copy of the demiurge's idea. Okay, so that's just some background. The important part is that in both of these cases, in Aristotle and Plato, in the use of examples for argumentation or in the construction of models, the type of inference that is made in the use of paradigms is an analogical inference. The analogy is a relation of sameness or similarity between separate things. There are two forms of analogy. One is continuous and the other one is proportional, or you can also say continuous and discrete, as we are familiar with when we compare an analog and a digital sound signal on an oscilloscope. Okay, so you can see there you've got two different versions of the same sound. The analog is direct and it's kind of true in a way, but the discrete or proportional one is reconstructed, and in a way it's actually a copy of the analog sound. So, and as you all know, if you compare the two figures, you get the analog one is a smooth line, and then you get the digital one, which is kind of made up of steps. Yeah. All right. So in any case, when we make use of analogies, we don't mean to say that whatever relation of similarity is drawn between different things, that the similarity between them is something essential in them. On the contrary, the analogy is not presupposed. It is sui generis. It is created out of the comparison between the particulars, which makes something or phenomenon intelligible. The analogy creates a tertium datur instead of a tertium non datur, the law of the excluded middle in classical logic. That is, this is why we can say that we are not making deductive or inductive inferences when we use analogies. The analogy creates a third, which includes the particulars, but suspends them at the same time to make something intelligible. This is why Simondon says about Cartesian mechanism that it is not that living beings are machines ontologically, but that they can be regarded as machines if they are to be considered as objects for scientific study. Let's have a sip of water here. Okay, so this reference to Cartesian mechanism brings us to the technical mentality again. Simondon defines his concept of technical mentality as consisting of three components. Firstly, there's the cognitive schema. Then there are the modes of affectivity. And thirdly, there's what he calls voluntary norms of action. With the cognitive schema, he identifies two schemes of intelligibility, which have the power to become universalizable, namely the Cartesian mechanism, as just discussed, and cybernetic theory. Although my discussion today is not going so much into the cognitive schemas of the technical mentality, it is worth noting that for Simondon, the Cartesian mechanism represents, and I quote, the fundamental operation of a simple machine, which is analogous to the functioning of logical thought capable of being rigorous and productive. A simple machine is a transfer system that, in the particular case in which the movement is presumed to be reversible, in the state of equilibrium, establish the identity of a work that puts into motion and a work that resists. Simondon ultimately wants to overcome the classical logic of the simple machine, and he introduces his theory of operations, namely electromatics, for the second of the cognitive schemas, namely cybernetics. The cybernetic scheme does not function the same way as the Cartesian scheme, since the aim of cybernetics is to regulate the behavior of apparatuses, which was born out of the mathematization of automatic regulation apparatuses that are particularly useful for designing airplanes in flight, and I quote again, with a recurring aim of information on a relay apparatus is a basic schema that allows for an active adaptation to a spontaneous finality. This technical realization of a finalized conduct has served as a model of intelligibility for the study of a large number of regulations or regulation failures in the living, both human and non-human, and of the phenomena subject to becoming, such as the species equilibrium between predators and prey, or geographical and meteorological phenomena, variations of the levels of lakes and climatic regimes. It is particularly in relation to the cybernetic creation of a technical reality, which I think he also distinguishes from the Cartesian mechanism or from the technical object. It seems to me like he says that that cybernetics creates a technical reality, and this technical reality is kind of dependent on operations. So it is particularly in relation to the cybernetic creation of a technical reality, which will be of concern to us in our consideration of biometrics, if it is considered that it is the creation of a centralized population register, which acts as a relay apparatus that allowed for the colonial states in South Africa, and then obviously apartheid, and even in the post-apartheid state, to have control over black migrant laborers. Okay, and this extends, of course, in post-apartheid, the way in which biometrics is being applied mostly is in cash transfer systems, where people who receive social grants get a smart card and they can withdraw money from mobile ATM kind of operations and so on. But the point is that people who receive social grants are kind of subjected to biometrics in order to access the money that they need. And the further consequences of this is that these systems are developed in tight relations between banks, commercial banks, and the state. All right, so here's my place here. Okay, but before we get to this point, it's also necessary to consider Simondon's discussion of the effective modalities of the technical mentality. And here again distinguishes between two modes. Firstly, there's the artisanal mode, when the user and the tool are united, in the sense that the user is both the source of information as well as of energy in the use of the tool. This changes with the industrial modality when the source of information and the source of energy are separated. The laborer becomes the source of information and nature becomes the source of energy. But Simondon goes further to explain that the industrial mode of production also leads to the standardization of parts, which allows for the industrial modality to take leave of the industrial center and mobilizes industrial production by virtue of the fact that the standardization of parts allows for the extension of industrial production through the connection of industries over greater geographical distances. The mobilization of industrial production is also what leads to the creation of networks or the network society. Simondon uses the example of the Eiffel Tower, the parts of which was manufactured in the factory and assembled on site. So the point being that it wasn't constructed on site. It was actually everything was manufactured in the factory, and he says that they assembled the Eiffel Tower without any faults. So all the standardized parts allowed for them to simply transfer from the factory to Paris to erect the tower. So in any case, and then it also becomes kind of a carrier of antennae, or so for communication networks to communicate. So what is more relevant for us in the context of South Africa is that the mobilization of the industrial mode, or the creation of networks through the standardization of parts, made it possible also to construct railway lines that connect geographically disparate parts of the world. Breckenridge also refers to Walter Rodney, who pointed out that one only has to look at the railway lines which connect to the ports that run across the land without considering the land and its people over which they are laid. The point being that the standardization of parts which accompanies the construction of the network society is also what permitted the colonial governments in South Africa to extract more resources. It is especially in relation to the mining industry that biometrics first developed in the 1900s in South Africa, in order for the mines to have better control over black migrant laborers whom colonial officials had difficulty in keeping tabs on, because the officials could not distinguish between individuals who were often also illiterate and could not write their names when they registered for work. There was also a tendency amongst the laborers to use names interchangeably, making it more difficult for mining officials to keep track of them, and often also meaning that they would employ the same, different companies would employ the same person. So for the mines, they had a problem. They wanted to have better control of the laborers. So central aspect to the development of biometric identification systems in South Africa, in contrast to Europe, was to develop a form of governance that was not indebted to writing. What we see with the creation of these centralized population registers is the standardization of identities by assigning an identity number to each individual and a fingerprint. In this way, the identity number standardizes the way in which the population can be controlled. So I will not attempt to recount the complex history which Breckenridge unpacks in his book. I will rather draw on a few particularities which seem striking to me if we are to consider the biometric state as the archetypal state of the digital form of governmentality. At the foundation of the biometric state is the statistical view of the world, and it's embodied by figures such as Francis Galton, the father of eugenics, a forefather of modern statistics, and the inventor of biometrics, which is a statistical technique. It is the statistical classification practices that originate with the biometric state, which we see repeated today, but not necessarily overtly as by an authoritarian regime. Rather, today, biometrics have become kind of a commodity in a way. For example, I'll give you a quote, and this was from, I think it was the Biometrics Institute, where they say, and just to keep in mind, in South Africa, I've realized this recently, we are so accustomed to fingerprints everywhere. You know, you want to visit someone, you have to use your fingerprint to get through the gate. There are fingerprints on our driver's license cards. The other day I picked up, someone got robbed, a Swedish person, and picked up their driver's license, and I was quite fascinated to see that there's no fingerprint on it. Although, what was interesting is that I could find all the details about this person online, because the Swedish government has a system which the apartheid government also tried to copy with what they call the Book of Life, which was meant for the white population, in order to track where you were living, or where you were living before you moved, or all these kinds of details that they wanted to kind of keep in a little book. So what I found when I picked up this driver's license is that I could actually see where this person was living in Sweden. I saw that this person moved into a new flat in March. Also found their cell phone number, contacted them, and gave them back their driver's license. So I guess it's a happy ending, but I mean, I think the Swedish should maybe reconsider what kind of information they make available. In any case, so the thing with biometrics is that it has a very negative connotation in Europe. Many Europeans are, because it's a political thing, they relate it to Nazi Germany. But the thing is, as Breckenridge points out, is that biometrics is already much older than the case of Nazi Germany, where people were tattooed and these things. And it's actually been developed in South Africa mostly. In any case, so in Europe, people are much more reluctant for biometrics. In South Africa, it's kind of, you can't do anything if you don't provide your fingerprint. But so the interesting thing that's happened with digitalization and commercialization of it and so on, is that these kinds of things have become much more okay. And this is especially since the arrival, and this is a quote, the arrival of the iPhone 5S certainly brought awareness of biometrics to consumers who are now using it on their mobile phone and no longer perceiving fingerprinting as something scary but convenient. So what we find is a kind of a maybe we can call this a form of individuation where we don't see these kinds of practices or techniques as being oppressive, but actually as kind of helping us. And especially if you're doing your banking on your phone and all these kinds of things, you see it as a convenience and also a form of security for you to be able to unlock your phone with your fingerprint, instead of it being maybe hackable by some pattern or whatever. So yeah, so basically, yeah, for me, maybe we can discuss this further later, but for me, the whole point is that it seems to me that the digitalization and so on is leading more towards a biometric society. There's a lot of things about facial recognition. I forget now what the scandal's name was, but there was an AI that was trained on pictures that were collected from, I don't know if it was Tumblr or something, but it was open source scraping of people's pictures, and it trained facial recognition software on people's pictures that they just put online. So we see that there are all these new forms of kind of control and subtle forms of control, which we might not always be aware of taking place. And my basic argument is that I think with digitalization, we are seeing that a new form of state is developing, and I think we can look at South African history if we want to understand what this kind of state would or could potentially turn out to be. So that's what comes.
Okay, so we've heard about, so I was thinking about that because the people online probably want to see you.
Okay.
So you can either,
Okay.
we think the sound is better there, but if you wanted to sit here, okay, so then you can certainly prefer so that at least they can see you. Yeah. Okay. So let's open up for some questions. I mean, that was really interesting. Of course, we are limited by time now. The seminar goes until 5, and then they'll be locking up the menu. But I think this was really interesting. Thank you both for very interesting and different presentations. And I think what we're learning, and I think Andreia was saying this earlier to our colleagues from Greece, is just the applicability across disciplines. And I think that was really interesting. I was like, okay, an economics, explain to me now. So I really just want to acknowledge and thank you both very much for your presentations. But let's hear, does anyone have any questions? Anything you want to ask? Yes, Andreia?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentations. I think it was interesting to see Simondon in open to the indeterminations and Simondon in the control. Use Simondon to understand different issues. But like a question or just to think together, talking about the brain, you showed many images of the brain. And the brain, the most of the images, the brain here. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit more, what is brain for you? What's the brain? Because you know that Varela and other authors think the brain as a body. And if you, sometimes you hear indigenous people thinking the brain as a forest, and even if you think about the brain, maybe through Simondon, we can think about the associative milieu. The brain is one associative milieu inside of another associative milieu. So just maybe break the idea of the brain in the mind and an individual brain, interiority, individual brain. I think maybe Simondon, through trans-individual and brain-individual, this collective that I think sometimes goes closer to the indigenous knowledge, that you can maybe think the brain more, how you said in the end, to trans-individual and collective way. But if you could talk more, what's brain?
Okay, so I very much don't think the brain is the bit of grey matter inside here. I'm very much with Varela on that. And in psychedelic research, there's the neuroscientific component, which tends to be very much mapping out brain dynamics in the very classical sense. But in psychedelic therapy, there's also this very long-standing idea of set and setting. And set typically refers to what's going on in your head and what you had for lunch and what happened to you last week and what you hope to get out of experience, all these kinds of things. And setting describes the environment that you have such an experience in and what the broader sort of like socio-political context is within which you're having these kinds of experiences and your milieu, right? So a Simondonian way of thinking about this is precisely what you're saying, that we internalize this associated milieu, right? You know, as living beings, individuation doesn't just happen on our edges, right? We internalize these pre-individual funds. And I think this, what I was talking about today, definitely needs to be situated within this. This is something I do in my PhD work. Needs to be situated within a larger discussion of set and setting and what Varela would talk about in terms of the autopoietic dynamic, whereby we're deeply, deeply reciprocally enmeshed with our environments, right? We recursively, systems that give rise to the environments that give rise to us are systems that give rise to environments. So this for me is very much also along the lines of what Simondon describes as psychic individuation involving this disparation between the collective and the living, right? But yeah, I think it's crucial to situate this whole conversation, and some people have started doing this, to situate this whole conversation within a broadly enactive frame. And there's even some critiques of this happening within psychedelic neuroscience where they're saying, look, you're putting someone in a laboratory, you're hooking an fMRI up to their brain, and you're not seeing an embodied being participating in the environment in a kind of meaningful way. Yeah.
Great. Just thank you for both really fascinating papers and an amazing amount of ground covered. And I thought really your some of what you said spoke to my comment earlier about maybe an apartheid understanding of the use of systems of control. I mean, and biometrics being, yeah, I think the body, the kind of, it's a biopolitics as well, right? So I think Keith very well writes about this, and his work is always very on point. He's a really good systems historian, actually. And I think maybe that's what I was trying to say, that I think it's very difficult for South Africans to, I don't know, cybernetics is very unfamiliar here, even as a discipline of like thinking about programming and computer science. And I think that if you compare like the Chilean example of cybernetics and a sort of social project, a project is also a social project. It's a social project organized around racial capitalism. So it's successful. It's a highly successful social project. And that maybe Allende's project would have been successful if it wasn't, derailed by the coup d'etat and whatever happened. The thing I'm trying to think about with you, maybe the naturalization of the biopolitical in our everyday as South Africans, the being used to being systematized in some way, and racial classification being such a intransigent thing actually in our everyday life still. And that recognition, that default that happens in the programming, I think those of us who grew up in apartheid schooling know very well that there's a programming, literally, like in the Southern where that one has had to undo. Maybe your generation less so, but you definitely know it because we're around each other. And I guess, and you know it from parents, and I mean, there's the things. So how do we kind of delink those things to think about another kind of technological future or another kind of way of thinking of social technologies, maybe in the way our colleague in Argentina wanted to think, like in a sense. But I think there's maybe some differentiation to make between technology and social technology here. And maybe the Foucauldian use of technology itself is kind of useful here as well. So there's something about biometric systems as a technology, but there's something about racial classification as a technology. But also, so I think there's a lot of work to do, and I think what you're doing is really interesting. The information department of information and the kind of information scandal in the 70s is something I've been trying to think a bit about. We should talk sometime. Thanks for trying to work through some of that area.
Thanks.
I'm just looking at the time, we've got about 10 minutes. Do you want to just pull some of it together?
Yeah, sure. I'll maybe just a few notes which I find interesting. So it's in Breckenridge's book where he talks about the 1950s. There was the population registration, but for white people and also coloreds and so on. And what happened there, which is interesting, and this is where the transduction, Simondon's idea of transduction becomes interesting for me, because the initial registration, the first one, a lot of people didn't want to register themselves because the families weren't all purely white. They had different races in their family and so on. And he mentions then by the second registration that this wasn't a problem anymore. So you could see how, in a way, that people started identifying with their race, and especially white people, and wanted to keep it pure because that's how the government wants it and so on. So for me, in terms of what is an alternative, I think what Simondon tells us at least is that the most important part is not to run away from thinking about technologies and these things, but to actually understand them and to actually see what are they doing, and what are the forms of individuation that take place through the adoption of certain technologies. And maybe it's developing more of a vigilance towards what our technology does to us, instead of blaming the technology, or maybe even, I don't know. That's basically.
That's great. So anyway, I'll put your email address.
Renzo, as we wrap up, do you, Andreia, want to say anything as we wrap up?
Absolutely.
Got a few minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rene. First of all, I want to say thank you very much. Very happy, very grateful. I must say that I'm very impressed because, as you say, Rene, in the beginning, it was a challenge to find Simondonians in South Africa. But I think we're very happy with the direction because it was very brilliant from your own perspective, and very diversity from very different perspectives from Simondon individuations, technical mentality, or trans individuation. That is another point, because collectivity, one of the main focus for Simondon, thinking collectivity as an assemblage of technology, and an assemblage of human beings, and an assemblage of non-human beings too. So how we can understand this inside the institution as an assemblage, that is a complete assemblage of thinkingness, ideas, diversities, techniques, cosmologies, is an important point for starting since this encounter about this encounter of Simondonian thinking, to think in our future projects as researchers, or as an artist, or as only as a human beings in this ecological situation, as as Pablo Manolo tell us very clearly, how we understand ecologically an institution too, how we understand ecologically an institution with all the systems inside of them. And also because we have this talking with Andreia the other day in Faculgesi and with my colleague Bettina, how intertwined cosmologies into technical practices, and how these cosmologies can be engaged with cosmological perspective and ecological perspective, because ecological perspective implies technodiversity perspective and no diversity perspective, that is many ways of knowledge. So very happy for that. Thank you, Rene, again for your support. And thank you, Andreia, too, for all your help all this time, for managing all this seminar, for the exhibition that we're going to have tomorrow and the workshop about Simondon, what is aesthetics, what can you understand aesthetics. So thank you, Rudi. Thank you, Aragorn. Thank you, Oliveira, for coming and your reflections. Yes, please. Thank you, for the people who is online too. Thank you very much, everybody. Maybe from Latin America and from here to South Africa. So it's a very nice meeting of reflection, critical reflections that we want to engage in the university and outside too. Thank you.
Just say thank you and invite you for tomorrow. So tomorrow morning we have a workshop in Simondon. I don't know if that's not right. Yes. And Rene and I will be working with some Simondon's ideas and think how these ideas can be brought, can we bring it to research in different fields. And afternoon we have 2 roundtables. One, Simondon in Latin America, 9 a.m. in Brazil, 2 p.m. in South Africa, and another roundtable, 10:15 in Brazil, 3:30 p.m. here in South Africa, Gilbert Simondon in Brazil. So you have researchers that have been researching Simondon in Latin America and Brazil to share some ideas. So thank you very much.
Thank you.